Welcome to our weekly class on Pirkei Avot, Ethics of the Fathers. Today's class is dedicated to the loving memory of Zizel Bakupsa, Zizel Bas Esther B'David, the mother of our own. And may her neshama have an aliyah. The soul should be elevated. And as Jews, we believe that the ultimate elevation of the soul is when it comes back down here in the Messianic age, together with all those who have passed on. And also we have to dedicate this class to the welfare, the well-being of all the Jews in Israel, especially the soldiers who are risking their lives to defend us, and for all Jews in the world who are now targeted the way the Nazis targeted Jews. Nothing has changed. And the biggest shock is the enablers. The head of the UN made a remark justifying what Hamas did. He didn't have to say it's justified. He just said, well, it didn't happen in a vacuum.
That's not the first.
You know, a person is walking down the street and murdered, and you say, well, it was terrible that he was murdered, but it wasn't in a vacuum. He was walking down the wrong street. He shouldn't have been in that street. That means that you're justifying it. And he refused to apologize, even though his apology would mean nothing to me. But this is the type of evil we're dealing with. The biggest problem is not the evil of the Hamas itself, but the people who are giving it, the Hamas, some way of, some form of justification. So what we need is eradication of all evil in this world, and we do that through studying Torah, among other things, which we're doing right now. We're going to be doing the 5th chapter, the 7th Mishnah. If you remember, in the previous weeks, we're talking about 10 utterances with which God created the world, 10 generations from Adam to Noah, 10 generations from Noah to Abraham. Abraham passed 10 tests, the 10 plagues, the 10 miracles in Egypt, the 10 miracles in the temple, 10 things that were created at Friday at twilight. That was the last thing we did. And now it transitions from 10 to 7. And numbers in Judaism have significance. 10 is the number of divine attributes. And also our soul possesses 10 faculties, 3 of which are intellectual and 7 of which are emotional. But now we go from 10, the next number is 7. It's not that 9 and 8 don't have any significance, but when you're talking about the human being, 10 represents the totality of the human being that mirrors the 10 divine attributes, and 7 focuses on the 7 emotional attributes. So what we're going to be talking about is 7 things that are characteristic in a clod. What's a clod? The Hebrew word is golem. Golem. You know what a golem is? Okay, a golem is a dummy. A dummy.
That kind of cloud.
A golem. You're a clod. Someone who's.
Golems were like a Frankenstein.
What?
We're like a Frankenstein.
Right. The golem. When you say the golem, that's referring to a creature, human-like, a humanoid, created through Kabbalistic powers that the Talmud discusses. That the rabbis of the Talmud created a golem, and another rabbi made sure that it would fall back and not have any life anymore. 400 plus years ago, the rabbi in Prague is reputed to have created a golem to protect the Jewish community. Now we need a lot of golems these days to do that. The golem is made out of earth, and it was animated through some divine power. And there's some controversy whether it's true, whether he made the golem or not. But no one ever questioned the idea that there is such a thing as a golem. But a golem is also used as a word to insult a person. If you want to insult someone, you call them a golem. That means they're a dummy, they're an idiot. But literally, the word golem means a piece of earth just a piece of earth that hasn't been formed into something. If you take, let's say, a piece of wood, before you form it into something, it's a golem. It has substance, but it has no form. That's what a golem is. Something that you could see it has substance. It is something, but it has no form, no real shape, no life, no inner meaning. So there are 7 things about a person who mirrors the characteristics of a golem, of a clod, and 7 in a wise person. In other words, we're going to list 7 different traits that characterize the golem, and the same 7 traits, if you reverse them, that's the chacham, that's the wise person. So it starts off by talking about 7 of a golem and 7 of the wise person. Now, why does it start off with a golem? Why doesn't it start with the wise person first? Because we all start as a golem. We're all unfinished products. When we're children, we have a body, we have physical characteristics, but we still haven't developed our full potential. We've just begun as a child, and as we mature, we become more and more developed, that the golem acquires a form, and that makes us into a full-fledged human being. Some people, even as they get older, present company excluded, of course, remain a golem. They may be bigger, they may have speech, they may have some measure of intelligence, but they still haven't really changed their essential nature of being a golem. And that's what he's referring to, these 7 people. Now, how do we determine whether you're a golem? You have to look at all these 7 characteristics and think of them in the reverse. And it's interesting, when he continues, he starts off with a wise person, and he talks about a wise person, all 7 characteristics of a wise person, and the very last sentence is, and the reverse of these is a clod. In other words, he doesn't want to talk about the negative, he wants to talk about the positive. And that's a very lesson in and of itself. If you have 2 ways of describing a situation, there's a positive aspect of it and there's a negative aspect. People tend to talk about the negative first. They identify the negative. But the truth is that the lesson here is that we should always try, it's not always easy, we should always try to have a bias for the positive. The psychologists talk about that human beings have a negativity bias. We see things, first we see the negative, and only afterwards could we look and find the positive. We have to train ourselves to have a positivity bias. And there's a book based on the Rabbi's teachings, a few hundred pages, to show how the Rabbi himself was obsessed with this idea of a positivity bias. And I think it's very important for us now, that what's going on in the world, and we tend to think about the negative. I mean, that's only normal, it's only natural for us to see the evil that's going on with Hamas, and the response of the world, and the enablers of the world. So we see the negative, but we should really try to focus on the positive. And what is the positive? There are a lot of positive things going on today, and the one that's most glaring and most obvious is how all the Jewish people in Israel, and I say all, I mean almost all, are united, regardless of the differences that they had in the past, the differences between Sephardic and Ashkenazic, between religious and secular, between Hasidim and non-Hasidim, between right-wing politicians and left-wing politicians. All of them have coalesced into one unified front that we have to get rid of the evil in the world. And they're not just saying that because they're fighting the same evil, but they're also helping one another. The amount of volunteers in Israel, what's going on, not only Israel, I just spoke to a member of the community here, Mr. Fried, whose grandson raised $20 million and flew one of those big planes, the C, what do they call, the huge cargo planes, filled with tons of supplies, with 150 reserve soldiers, and flew it to Israel. Some of you know Mr. Fried, Leo Fried, and this is his grandson from Puerto Rico. And just one example of how much is being done to help the Jews in Israel. So we should try to focus on the positivity before we focus on the negativity, because it's the positive energy that will extinguish the dark, extinguish the power, the energy of the evil that is so powerful these days. So let's go through these 7 different qualities. Just one other comment about a golem. Maimonides says that there are 3 terms that our sages use for people who are less than ideal, to put it mildly. One is called a boor. It's the same word in English as it is in Hebrew. It's interesting. A boor is a boor. But what does it mean? Maimonides defines it by referring to an expression used in the Mishnah, but a field, that's a field, a boor field. A boor field is a field that doesn't produce grain. It's a field, it has the potential, but doesn't realize its potential because it wasn't cultivated properly. I would add to that, in Hebrew there's another word very similar called bor. Bor means a pit, an empty pit. But it's referring to someone who has potential, but doesn't, it's referring to someone who's empty, who doesn't have any substance whatsoever. That's the boor.
Does that say boor ve'am haaretz?
Yes. The next one is the am haaretz. Am haaretz is usually translated as an ignorant person, but that's not what it really means. Literally, am haaretz means a nation of the earth. That means a person who is very down to earth, not sophisticated, but still is a good person. The boor can't be a good person because they have no substance. There's nothing there. They're empty suits. They have no intellectual capacity and they have no emotions. They have no empathy, no sympathy. Just people who just live a physical. They breathe physically. Their hearts beat, but there's nothing there, no substance. That's the lowest level. The am haaretz is someone who's intellectually wanting. True, they're not knowledgeable, they're not sophisticated, but they're decent people. They're people who get along with other people. They contribute to the civilization of the world. They contribute to society, although they're pretty dull in terms of their intellectual achievements. That's the am haaretz. The third category is one notch higher, and that's the klad, the golem. The golem is someone who has potential, but has not yet fulfilled or realized his or her potential. That's the golem. It's like something that has already substance, but the shape has not fully taken place. It has not been shaped with all of its qualities. And that's something that describes most of us. Maybe overwhelmingly, we do not fulfill our potential. We have much more potential than we realize. People who like to knock themselves and says, well, I'm not such a smart person, I'm not that educated, I'm not that capable, I'm not that good. That's a very dangerous attitude to take because that cuts off your ability to fulfill your potential, to realize the potential that we really have. They say that we only use a certain percentage of our brain's power. And I read this somewhere that's a misnomer. That's not true. That was not what was said originally. But I think it is true because I can give you so many cases of people who were very, very limited intellectually. And they worked hard, they struggled. It took them time. I think I shared this story once before. When I was a teacher in Australia, I had a student who was an engineer. So he was a bright fellow. And he came to study Talmud, and I taught him for about an hour or so, and he couldn't absorb it. So I repeated the same class the next day, and the next day, and the next day, and the next day. This went on for 2 weeks. That means 12 days, almost consecutive. Shabbos I didn't teach. 6 days of the week I was teaching him the same thing, and it didn't enter his thick mind. And he would walk down the street with a sheet of paper trying to memorize the translations of the words. He struggled I taught him an hour or two a day, but he reviewed it 10 hours that day. He walked in the street with it in his hands, not afraid of the traffic. He just crossed the street, wasn't looking anywhere. After 2 weeks, it finally penetrated, and he became the best student. So if I can see that a person who was a real clod, who couldn't absorb anything, but 2 weeks of struggle, he was the best student, that shows that there is hope for everyone. If we only realize that there's so much more potential that we haven't realized. There was a famous chassid whose name was, maybe I should try harder. Rabbi Lepler was his name. Yekusiel Lepler. He was a very simple Jew. Very simple. He barely knew the translation of the Hebrew prayers. That's it. And he worked hard. He got a blessing from the Alter Rebbe, the first Chabad Rebbe. He became the most advanced scholar of Hasidic philosophy, where anyone who had and the second Rebbe wrote a book, which is the most difficult Hasidic work in existence. And he's Imre Bina, the words of understanding. It's a large book, and it's the most advanced, the most difficult, most abstract. And the Mittler Rebbe, the Rebbe who wrote it, says, I wrote it for this chassid. And he would guide other scholars and give them interpretation of it. He started off as a clod, as a golem, and he became the most sophisticated scholar in that area. Those are, of course, extreme examples, but every one of us has the potential. So we might be golems, but we have the potential of becoming sophisticated scholars, or not only scholarship, but also in terms of our emotions. We could work on ourselves, and we could become so much better people. And we shouldn't think, well, this is the way I am. This is one of the most dangerous statements that people make. Don't try to change me. This is the way I am. Well, the way you were when you were born was also the way you were, and yet you changed a little, hopefully. So who says you have to remain the way you are? We all have to try to change and become better, because we have more potential. So the wise person then is the person who tries to realize his or her potential. That's the difference between the wise person and the golem. So let's go through the 7 qualities. Do not speak before whom is greater than he in wisdom and experience. What does that mean? There are two different translations here. The Hebrew word for before, as well as the English word, has 2 possible meanings. Before is something in time, that a wise person is together with someone who you know is wiser than you. Don't try to be the first speaker. First, listen to what the wiser person has to say, and then add your own ideas. Don't try to get in there first. There's a story of one of the greatest, if not the greatest, Talmudic scholar of the 20th century, Rabbi Yosef Rosen, known as the Rogachover. And he was a very witty person and very sharp, and he didn't suffer fools. And he was once at a conference, and he hated being honored. He didn't have time for all this nonsense of being honored. You do this, you do that, you'll be first. So he was at a conference that was not a rabbinic conference. It was lay people who thought they were very smart, and they asked him to speak first. So he said, no, I have to speak last before all of you. And they said, why? He said, because it says in the Talmud. Yeah, the Talmud says that you have to speak last and we have to speak first. It says, yes, it says in the Talmud that idiots, the older they get, the more idiotic they become. So you better speak first, because if you wait another hour, you'll become even more idiotic than you are now. He was not very diplomatic, to put it mildly. If you're smart, you wait your turn. You don't have to rush to give your opinion. Let the others talk before you, and you know what will happen? You'll hear what they have to say, and maybe it'll enlighten you, even though you're superior to them intellectually, but nevertheless, they may have something good to say, or maybe they'll say something foolish, and you'll be able to correct them. You'll be able to show them the error of their ways. So it's always a healthy thing to let others speak later. That's one translation, before. That don't try to speak before others that are greater than you. Let them speak first. The other translation is, before means in the presence of. Don't speak in the presence of someone who is greater than you in wisdom and experience. You don't have to show off your own knowledge in front of someone who's smarter than you. Always give deference to those who are more intelligent than you. Well, the second thing he said.
Wait,
Yes.
looks like there's a word missing in the translation. So what does uberminyan mean?
A wise man does not speak before in the presence of one who is greater than he in wisdom.
What uberminyan? It says b'chachma uberminyan.
Oh, they translate it here as experience. The Hebrew word literally means the count. Count of what? Be smarter than you in wisdom and in numbers. So one of the interpretations is it means in age. What does that mean in age? The Talmud says that you have to give respect for a senior citizen. So if ever a senior citizen walks into this room, we'll have to show them respect. But we're all youngsters here. But we have to show respect for seniority. 90 is middle age. So anyone who's over 100, we have to show respect for. But the Talmud says, what about if it's a person who's not particularly intelligent, an older person? They might not even be very well, then there's nothing special about them. You also have to show them some respect. Why? Because seniority itself, the experience of life, is knowledge. People who lived longer gain certain experiences that young people, no matter how smart they are, cannot have.
Isn't we say the V'adavta pnei zaken?
Yes, that's what it's based on. That's the biblical command. But the Talmud translates that zaken doesn't mean old. Zaken means a scholar, a person who acquired wisdom. But yet the Talmud says you should also respect people who are older, even if the person is not a scholar, not a very smart person, because they were educated by life. I told this story many times. Esther Youngrise was a famous speaker, Holocaust survivor, and she had a good command of English language and very, very intelligent, of course. She wrote several books and a very good dynamic speaker. So someone asked her, where were you educated? Which university? And she said, in the University of Bergen-Belsen. And the Holocaust survivor who didn't even go to school is much more educated than most university professors. Talking about university professors, that's the lowest position you could be in these days, because they're horrible the way they've slanted their views towards the evil in this world, or they won't speak out against evil. So answering your question, what he means over here, according to one opinion, that someone who's superior to you in wisdom, but even if he's not superior in formal knowledge, but he's older than you, don't be so hasty to speak before in his presence or before him in terms of time. Another translation of minyan, which means count, means the count of students. If you have fewer, you're a teacher, you have fewer students than someone else, then that person has a certain, obviously more people are attracted to that person's knowledge, so you have to respect that and do not speak before them or in their presence. show a little bit of humility. And if you really think about it, most of these 7 things revolve around one trait, and that's the trait of humility. Because even if you're smarter than someone else, a humble person will always see the other person being smarter than you. You'll always see the other person has certain qualities that you don't have, and you'll focus on those qualities. So a humble person could be the smartest person in the world, but appreciates the wisdom of others. So you should never try to speak before someone else. Always try to defer to the other person. So if you all want to take over the class, you're more than welcome. But of course, there are exceptions to every rule. The next one does not break into his fellow's speech, or does not interrupt the speech of the fellow. There are many examples of this, biblical examples. Abraham, we're going to read about it this week. Abraham is told by God that God is going to destroy the city of Sodom and its sister cities. And Abraham comes to defend the cities, and he asked God, if there are 50 righteous people, will you spare the city? God says, yeah, I'll spare it. What about 45? No, yeah, I'll spare it. What about 40? What about 30? What about 20? What about 10? And of course, there were not even 10. There were not even 5. There was not even 1. Abraham's nephew was saved only because of Abraham, but there was no one worthy of being saved. So why didn't God tell him, Abraham, save your breath? Why are you starting with 50? There's not even 1. I could have told you, God could have told Abraham right away. When he asked for 50, he says, Abraham, don't waste your breath. Not only are there not 50, there's not even 1. And that would have been the end of the conversation. But God didn't want to interrupt Abraham. Now, that's the example given by commentators. The only problem with this example is, what was God accomplishing by letting Abraham talk and waste his time? He was going to destroy Sodom anyhow. And God knew that Abraham was going to ask for 50 and 45 and 40 and 30 and 20 and 10, and there was not even 1. He could have just cut it short, cut to the chase, and just told him there's nothing there.
God wanted Abraham to arrive at his own conclusion.
Okay, why? Why is that so important? But I think God wanted Abraham to show his compassion. He wanted to elicit Abraham's compassion. I'm not giving up. I asked for 50, there's no 50, so let it be. What about 45? What about 40? What about... And he kept on going. Every time Abraham said something, Abraham was demonstrating how much compassion he had for everyone, for even people of the caliber of the Sodomites, who were such evil people. Abraham was the model, a paragon of kindness and compassion. So every time he spoke, the same thing, when you interrupt someone, you cut short some of what the person wanted to say. That could have been words of wisdom, could have been words of goodness. When someone is speaking, don't try, even if you disagree with what they say, don't try to cut them short, because they may say something that's worthwhile hearing. And you're cutting them short, you're preventing that. So a wise person will not cut someone short. My question is, what about if you're in a class and someone asks a question and he's going on and on, droning on and giving a speech? It happens. So the teacher is not supposed to get upset. He's not even supposed to show he is upset, he's impatient. But what about if the other students get impatient? So that's a tough one. I'm still trying to sort that out, because it happens in every class. The teacher should encourage asking questions, but long speeches.
But there's that but.
But the long speeches get in the way of the other students who are not interested. So there's always a balance. The balance is that everyone has to try to be patient and try to learn something from the question. But the student or the person who's listening and asking the question and not being interrupted, that person should realize that it's not the right place and the right time for it. Just like, in society is divided into two sides of everything. There's the teacher, there's the student, there's the doctor, there's the patient, there's the lawyer, there's the client, there's everything, the landlord, the tenant, everything, employer, employee, everything is the giver and the receiver. They both have responsibilities towards one another. The Talmud speaks about a host has responsibility towards his guests. The guests have responsibility towards the host. And each person has to focus on their responsibility. I shouldn't be thinking about your responsibilities because I'm teaching. You shouldn't be thinking about my responsibilities, although I don't mind if you do. But you're not required to, at least. Each side should be thinking first and foremost about their own responsibilities. If your responsibility is to teach others, then that's your responsibility to make sure that the students on the receiving end get what they're supposed to get. So the same thing over here. The one who's speaking, the one who's listening, has a responsibility not to interrupt, not to barge in the middle of the discussion. But the teacher, the one who's speaking so long, also has a responsibility not to just keep on going on and boring the students or taking away time from the other students. That's a mutual responsibility. There was once a speaker who was going on and on and on for like an hour, and no one could interrupt him. And at one point he said, I once heard from a scholar, and he quotes him, and someone jumped up and says, no, that's not true. You never heard anything from a scholar. He says, how do you know that? He says, because how would you have ever listened to what anyone else has said? There are some people like that who just feel that they have to take over everything and no room for anyone else.
But then previously you said if somebody is older, then you have to give them respect, whether they're a clod or not.
You have to give them respect. That's true.
So you can't interrupt somebody.
But the person who's doing the talking has a responsibility not to harass the audience.
You take them aside and say, next week, don't.
Right. People have to learn what is proper, but the onus, the main burden is on you would think is on the one who's doing the talking. No, the main burden here is on the person who's listening. Yes.
But out of that certain situation, I did you on YouTube 2 weeks ago. So, and I heard that whole headbutting thing that went on, and that's what I remember because his neighbors aren't Jewish, and that's what I remember from his conversation.
I don't remember what you're referring to.
No, stop it. Okay.
Oh, okay, I now remember. Okay, the next one is, and is not hasty to answer. Some people think that if you're really smart, you can answer a question right away without thinking. There are many people who can do that, who can answer right away. It reminds me of a story. There was a great scholar who started the Musar movement, the Jewish ethical movement, Rabbi Salanter. And he was a brilliant scholar, had a very sharp mind, but he focused his life on teaching ethics. And he once came to a community. This custom in this community was that when great scholars would come to town, and this town had a lot of their own scholars, they would publicize that everyone should come to hear his lecture, which was a very advanced level lecture. And the lecturer, the visiting rabbi, would have to give a list of all his references that he would be quoting, so people could look up the sources, so they should be prepared for the lecture. And here he comes to town, and he submitted all his references, that he prepared a very extensive and very deep lecture. And he comes to town, he goes into the synagogue, and it was pasted on the wall, and he looks at someone had taken off his list of references and put up a completely, totally different subject with totally different references as a practical joke to embarrass him. So he gets up there to the podium and he looks at the references and he waits about 5 minutes and he delivers a brilliant lecture on the spot that he made up based on all those references. And it was a brilliant lecture, as if he had prepared it for days and hours. Afterwards, he said to the people, maybe they asked him, and this was in response, they asked him, why did you wait 5 minutes? He says, I waited 5 minutes because I wanted to know, I was asking myself, will this be arrogance on my part to show my brilliance? And on one hand, I felt I should just step down. You got me. You gave me a challenge, and I couldn't meet this challenge, and shown humility. On the other hand, this would have been I would be giving in to the tyranny, to the evil of people trying to deceive. They could have done this to other rabbis who couldn't make up an advanced lecture on the spot. So it took me 5 minutes to decide, and I finally erred on the side of not letting this go unpunished. Yes.
I heard when I was in Israel many, many years ago that there is a tradition where to give a mystical teaching based on a pen and a book. So you insert a pen through a book, and then you tie, flipping through where the pin is hit on that word, these things. Have you ever heard of that?
I heard of something similar to that. There were some people, I knew of people like that. I didn't know anyone like that, actually, or maybe I did know one person like that, who can put a pin in any volume of the Talmud, and you just tell him which page the pin would, and he can tell you every word that the pin would go through on every page of that volume.
Maybe that was the correct, maybe I misunderstood it.
There was.
Are we supposed to stick a pin in the Talmud?
That's what I was thinking when I
That's a
asked
good
the
question.
The way I remembered it, I was wondering if that would...
You don't have to stick the pin. You could just put your finger on it, and then.
I knew someone like that, so actually 2 people.
Yeah, there are people who have this crazy memories, and most people who have these crazy memories waste their memories on nonsense. But at any rate,
The Lieberman supposedly could do that.
who?
Lieberman.
I believe it. Yeah. So a scholar doesn't have to answer right away. There's no need to show off, and we have a precedent for that in the book of Job. Job was the guy who was God-fearing, and God was testing him. The Satan, Eov. The Satan comes to God and says, this Eov, Job, is such a righteous person, let me test him. And he caused his children to die, and he lost all his wealth and everything, and he was covered with boils and suffering terribly. And 4 of his friends came to comfort him and to give him some counsel, some advice. And the 3 of them spoke to him, and in chapter 32, I think it is, the 4th one opens his mouth. Where was he until now? 3 are speaking, and the 4th one didn't say a word. So the 4th one said, I was waiting to hear some words of wisdom, and when I heard everything you said, and I wasn't satisfied with what you said, so now I'm going to talk up. He could have said his thing right away, but he didn't want to speak, interrupt what the others. He didn't want to be hasty to reply, not interrupt. He didn't want to be hasty to reply.
What is an Eov?
Eov is Job, the book of Job,
okay.
the biblical book of Job. Why is it important to not be hasty to answer? Because sometimes you didn't really understand the question. If you waited a little, and the person who could articulate the question better, you would get the real nuances of that question. But if you're hasty, maybe you didn't really hear the question. I've had that experience with teachers who you ask a question to, and they answer right away, but they didn't really hear your question, and they answered to a question that was not the question you asked. That's one aspect of it. Another aspect of it, even if you're brilliant and you could think of an answer right away, maybe if you thought about it, you'd think of a better answer or a better way of presenting the answer. So you'd always gain by waiting and not being hasty in answering. I think lawyers tell their clients, when they ask you a question, don't rush to the answer. Think a little before you answer. Make sure that what you're going to answer is not going to incriminate you or won't. People like to talk a lot. People like the attention, so they say everything they shouldn't be saying if they're trying to defend themselves. Any lawyers here? So, was that good advice?
It is good advice.
Okay, so it's based on ethics of the fathers. Don't be hasty in answering. Okay, we'll have to do the rest next week, God willing. Any questions?
Thank you so much.
That's not a question, that's a statement.